Hello, everyone. It's me, Bryson P., and I have a question for you. What if the Russians turn on Putin? As unlikely as that is to happen, the Infographics channel has made a video about that exact circumstance. So let's get straight into this and find out, what if Russians turn on Putin? Here we go.
Things are looking grim for old Vladimir Putin as the Ukraine war spirals out of control. His troops are being routed, and devastating sanctions continue to ruin Russia's economy. His response has been to escalate further, shelling Ukrainian civilians indiscriminately and threatening the use of nuclear weapons. He's even ordered a partial mobilization of Russian troops, a mass draft that looks to send hundreds of thousands of troops into harm's way with little training and subpar weapons. Surely he won't have the public support to win the next election with this kind of performance. Yeah, not so much, because while Vladimir Putin is technically elected democratically, his regime is anything but free and fair. Elections in Russia tend to be a preordained affair, with Putin's party winning overwhelmingly and opposition leaders frequently being arrested or disqualified by the government. The one time Putin left office since becoming president in the early 2000s was due to term limits, and he set up his second-in-command Dmitry Medvedev to take his place while he took the number 2 seat. Medvedev then changed the law to remove the term limits, and Putin was right back in 2 years later. So Putin clearly isn't going away anytime soon. The most recent
Alright, so that was going to be one of the first things, if he didn't go into that, was going to be, he's not going to be voted out. The the chances of there being a actual vote that is, true and sincere and democratically held like that to take him out of power, come on. We know that that's not going to happen, so I'm glad that Infographics was very straightforward with the fact that those laws were changed and basically established to where Putin can maintain all in total control until the Russians turn on Putin.
The most recent Russian legislative elections in 2021 saw Putin running under the independent line, which only represents his personal political brand, win over 3/4 of the vote, with the only other candidates getting more than 2% of the votes being the remnants of the old Communist Party and the eccentric fascist party led by longtime Russian crack candidate Vladimir Zhirinovsky. All major reform parties barely charted, and most had been outlawed or otherwise restricted. And the opposition...
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm pretty sure you won't see any type of progressive parties, or as I guess we would consider, or I would consider, far left-leaning parties.
Often has more to worry about than just being banned from running. Most famously, global anti-corruption activist Alexei Navalny was penalized by Russia on trumped-up charges, then poisoned by Putin while abroad, and then sentenced to prison in Russia for failing to appear in court on time while he was in the hospital. Even more of an escalation, Putin's allies in Belarus forced an Irish plane carrying a Belarusian opposition leader to land under false pretenses and then arrested their target while he was on another country's plane. It's clear that Putin's intention is to make the price of opposition far too high for anyone to be willing to pay. And that's what the other guys thought too. Russia has had a long history of taking care of business when the leader is deeply unpopular and not receptive to change. Most famously, Tsar Nicholas II saw himself deposed and later murdered by revolutionary forces, leading to the rise of the Soviet Union. And over half a century later, the last Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev saw his empire undone by mass protests that led to the toppling of the Berlin Wall and was then overthrown by hardline communist forces who were then promptly overthrown by democratic forces. Is the same about to happen to Putin? If Putin...
I just don't foresee it. I mean, we're talking about quite a suppression of anything and everything right now going on inside of Russia, and I'm pretty sure that there's a extensive amount that we don't have any idea about because we don't have that type of government clearance, and they're not, of course, releasing that type of data either for us to know. But I foresee that there's going to be a whole lot more that has to happen before you got to that point. It's just, unfortunately, there's quite a grip that Putin has on his own people, and I believe that that's just the way that it is at the moment. Because if it wasn't that way, we would be seeing more signs of that. Wouldn't you agree?
Putin is removed from power, it won't be through elections, as he's quickly consolidated the power of the ballot box. But it wasn't elections that did in the Tsar or Gorbachev. And there's one thing Putin can't account for: the power of the people. Russians were largely in favor of the Ukraine war at first, as Putin boasted of restoring the glory of the Russian Empire. Then their tanks and ships started being blown up, the sanctions cut them off from the rest of the world, and platoon after platoon of Russian men wound up coming home in coffins. The situation was bad enough, and then the draft started, with reports of it being concentrated in ethnic minority areas that Putin was happy to turn into cannon fodder. And soon enough, people filled the streets. Protests were taking place as soon as the war began, and they were met with strong opposition from the government. Those who participated were quickly arrested, often charged with serious crimes like sedition, and new laws were passed banning anti-war statements. Even those who simply signed petitions have been targeted. It sent the anti-war movement underground for.
And if I'm not mistaken, there have already been two, possibly three, conscripts, as far as mass conscripting of people and bringing them in to basically give them little to no training at all, and then push them to the front lines of the Ukraine war.
For a long time, but with the introduction of the mobilization and conscription, many feel like they have nothing to lose. Within a day of the mobilization announcement on September 21st, new protests had broken out in the streets, and over 2,000 people were quickly arrested. But the protests are only growing. Most dramatically, on September 25th, a group of women in the Sakha Republic held a major rally chanting, "We will not give up our husbands." Sure enough, the Russian police in the Siberian region soon dispersed the protest, but with less force than they usually do. Maybe they were worried about the bad press, or maybe they had some sympathizers in the security forces. While those in Putin's enforcement agencies are very cautious about criticizing the government in any way, there have been reports of Russian soldiers disobeying orders, trying to surrender to the Ukrainians, or fleeing to other countries. But the biggest challenge to Putin might come from within. Putin is not accountable to anyone, and that's a problem. He's had 20 years to build his network of support, and he's not taking any chances. He's notoriously insular, only surrounds himself with loyalists, and won't even let them get close to him. He is known for sitting over 10 feet away from anyone else in meetings, which likely results in a lot of yelling. But as things deteriorate, it's not clear if even that will save him. After all, it was Hitler's elite military officers, like Klaus von Stauffenberg and Erwin Rommel, who eventually plotted to kill him as the war spun out of control. And it might be getting out of control awfully fast. Putin has relied on his military team to deliver victory, and is quick to relieve people of their duty if they disappoint him. That was what happened to Sergei Shoigu, a general and minister of defense who was one of Putin's most trusted allies since 2012, an ethnic Tuvan.
There's also a lot of reports here lately of a lot of attacks that are happening, and being blamed on what we call false flag attacks. Hopefully, that's the term that's used throughout the globe, so that way you all understand what I'm saying. But basically, a recent bombing and attack that happened inside Russia, that Russia claims to have came from Ukraine, but was instead an inside job done by Russia themselves, so that way they could use that as reason to blame more on Ukraine. And then the same thing, I've also seen reports and I've heard different things that the same happens with Ukraine, and there have been attacks that are staged so that way Ukraine can use that as boosting why it needs additional supplies or additional support from other countries. You almost like going to desperate measures to get your backing and your support from leaving.
From Siberia, he was seen as a pragmatic leader who was a shrewd military mind. But as the war went on, his tactics seemed to be less methodical for Putin. Militants within the administration wanted Shoigu removed, and his replacement would be even more militant. Another warrior from an unlikely background, Ramzan Kadyrov is the leader of the Chechen Republic. a
Yeah.
Muslim region where Putin brutally put down secession movements in the last decade. Known for his persecution of his own people, particularly women and gay residents, Kadyrov became infamous for his brutality during the Ukraine war, which only
Yeah. Isn't he also part of the Wagner group? If I'm not mistaken. He should. I've seen his picture and I've seen his name and I've read a few articles about him. He may not be part of the Wagner group, but I know that he's within those types of associations.
led Putin to promote him. While Shoigu called for focusing on consolidating Russia's Western gains, Kadyrov was boastfully saying Russia should use nuclear weapons, and naturally it meant it was time for Putin to promote him again. So the question is, has Putin gotten too powerful to be overthrown? He controls the levers of the electoral process. Most of his opposition is in prison. The security forces brutally put down any popular resistance, and he replaces his generals and officials with hardline loyalists at the drop of a hat. Any move against him will be extremely hard to pull off, and incredibly dangerous for anyone involved. But that may not be enough to stop it. After all, for people to sit back and let a dictator run the show, they have to feel like they have too much to lose from rebelling. And for most Russians right now, that might not be the case. Their sons and husbands are being drafted into a meat grinder of a war, their economy is crashing, and they can't even get Netflix anymore thanks to sanctions. And the next protest might be too big to contain. What happens if tens of thousands of Russians take to the streets, not just
That's going to be my question. And I was just about to ask, what happens if tens of thousands of Russians take to the streets? Do you think that, given the circumstances of this war and the fact that Putin has showed complete disregard for everything up to this point, where does he cross the line of turning on his own people? Or where do his own um, select few that are within his immediate circle, where do they have a personal line where they will not turn on their own people? You know, they're going to up to a certain point, but where does that bridge start to get weak?
to protest but to fight. It's near impossible to contain something like that, and there are two possible approaches for a government to take. In 2020, when the United States was shocked by the murder of George Floyd, massive protests that turned into riots broke out in major cities. While the police forces did try to restore order, it was largely ineffective, and the governments mostly allowed the protests to die out, rather than trying to bring in federal troops to restore order. While there were many arrests,
That's not, you can't use that as an example. Sorry, Infographics, but that is not an example. You're talking about the police trying to maintain control and order and everything else versus a hostile government that is being controlled by one person or one person and a select few that are trying to cause a mass casualty situation in order to control a section of land, right? Completely opposite. This is someone that is invoking a war and not willing to stop until that is succeeded, versus an incident that happened that should have never happened, and now they're trying to play protection. It's completely different scenarios.
and standout cases, even Donald Trump seemed to hesitate to truly quell them by force. Despite many tweets to the contrary, it took the better part of a week before large-scale protests died down. And that was not the approach taken in another country. Ever since the revolution in 1979, Iran has occasionally seen major protests, usually driven by controversies over election results or the treatment of women, both under former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and current President Ibrahim Raisi. The government responded with overwhelming force, often killing protesters in full view of the world as a way to scare the others out of resisting, and so far, it stopped the government from being overthrown. But in 2022, the protests don't seem to be slowing down. Which route will Putin take? There are dangers for him in both. If he chooses to take a hands-off approach to mass protests, it stands the risk of making him look ineffectual, at which point hardliners might start grumbling that he's lost his edge and it's time for him to step aside. On the other hand, if he starts ordering the deaths of protesters and committing atrocities against his own people in plain view, the government might decide he's become unstable, Either one could open him up to a palace coup, which
Yeah. And then that leads to the next question of, let's say that we come to this exact situation that we're seeing right here, where he has turned on his own people and killing them openly like this for mass protests. What point do you then support us, not us as in the United States, but us as in all of the people on the outside looking in? At what point do we say enough is enough? And it's not just about the Ukraine Russia war, it's now about stopping a sadistic person that is killing his own citizens. You know, because then we have to have a line as well that we're willing to cross in order to protect others. At some point, where that line is, I can't tell you. But at some point, just like with him, let's say that he does do that. Well, once you start killing your own people and you start causing these types of actions and reactions, you can't take your foot off the gas pedal at that point, because then you do get overthrown. You know, you have to basically rule with an iron fist the entire time, because as soon as you stop and you start to show love and compassion and not doing that, then it's very likely that that's whenever you get stabbed in the back. So honestly it's a no-win situation for Putin, really. But the thing is just a matter of time and at what expense and at whose expense and at how many expenses.
might be the biggest threat to his power. But would it actually work? That might depend on one key question. Outside Russia, NATO and its allies are watching with horror as Putin continues to terrorize Ukraine. But their hands are tied, because Putin is likely to view any direct intervention as an act of war against Russia and then kick off World War III. So that means any direct move to remove Putin is unlikely, unless it came from...
Which, of course, leads to the very last section to this of, at what point then does he turn on everyone else and start World War III? And at what point does that... So, you know, it's basically right now, it's in the situation that it's in, and it's a very fine line that's having to be walked on a daily basis, because we don't have, again, that type of government clearance to know the knowledge of the inner workings of what may or may not be happening, or what type of true risks there are and are not.
Within. If the average Russian has turned against Putin and the war continues to become deeply unpopular, a resistance leader or even an insider who's decided it's time to take Putin out might find covert support from outside the country, and that could change everything. Putin is unlikely to be removed from office via conventional means. Even if the average Russian turns against him, he's proven he's more than willing to put down popular revolts and has largely purged his inner circle of anyone who might be opposed to the current war. But that won't protect him if everyone starts to think he's endangering the future of Russia itself. If the pressure builds, a palace coup is the most likely scenario to remove a deeply unpopular Putin who refuses to compromise. In that event, the replacement would either be a more pragmatic leader like Shoigu, or a more radical force who vows to complete the mission Putin failed to, like Kadyrov. The former is likely to be the choice of a coup organized from within the NATO backing, but the latter could take advantage of the chaos and rise to power instead. What would a Russia look like under a new leader? It depends. The former would likely negotiate a way out with NATO and Ukraine, ordering a ceasefire and offering them peace in exchange for Russia keeping its current gains. This might work and it might not, but the goal would be to find a respectful way out for everyone that would get Russia out from under the sanctions and relieve the domestic pressure it's feeling at the moment. But it's not likely to result in a turn to democracy for Russia. The new leader, whoever they are, would be faced with an angry public with lots of demands, and they would not want to appear weak. So the odds are that while the tension might drop if Putin is toppled, it would not solve all of Russia's larger problems. Of course, Putin could see the public pressure, realize the error of his ways, and change course instead of doubling down. No, not likely.
I highly doubt
Putin has stayed in power this long?
Okay, so that was the infographics. What happens if the Russians turn on Putin? I think I've already told you my opinions on that. I think there's some good comparisons. I think that there were a couple bad comparisons. Even though I understand where the comparison was trying to be made, I just think that it was a bad comparison because you're talking about complete opposites. of what was trying to be achieved during those times. That's my perspective. Other than that, it's going to be tough to really have some type of change. It's unfortunate to say that, but there's going to unfortunately be a lot more that happens, I feel like, before we get to a point of there being a voluntold change or a force of change. I could be wrong, and I would love to be wrong in this instance, and for there to be a positive change that happens tomorrow. That would be a wonderful thing. But realistically, that's not what's going to happen. Thank you for watching. I hope that you have a great day, great night, whatever time it is that you see this. And if you have a video suggestion, let me know in the comments below. Goodbye.